Well, good morning, everybody. What a great day it is. Friday, payday. How can you be uptight on a day like today? Well, today I'm going to kind of show you how to review a paper. Um, I took this paper off of FE Core's website, um, and we'll get into that in a minute. This has to do with Airy's failure. You can also look that up on Google. So we have Airy's experiment, which was a failure. FE Core plans to repeat that experiment, and it will be a failure, I think. So here's how to fail at a failed experiment. Joke of the week. There are 10 types of people in the world. Think about that. So first, before we start, I have some disclaimers to make. I want to make it clear that I've taken this abstract written for public consumption at the FE Core website. It's open to everyone. You can get there by that link. I have in no way edited, added, or deleted from that public work. Any quotes from there will be clearly marked, and the comments that I make will be clearly distinguished. This is meant to be a peer review of one paper, and it's not a reflection on the quality of the staff at FE Core. The outcome of the experiment has not been published yet, and while setbacks are to be expected, there has been no update from FE Core in 2 months, even though they said that the ending would be August 29th. So the introduction to their paper says, when we introduced Airy's failure, FE Core success project, I stated that Airy didn't fail to prove something. His experiment merely failed to support a theory. While that's true, there remains a perhaps more important reason why Airy's experiment was a failure. That is because whereas he gathered excellent data from high-quality observations, he failed to determine any meaning or cause of his observations. That is a failure as a scientist to find facts and simply discard them because you didn't like the facts. Experiments are designed and have assumptions unique to that experiment. So if I have an experiment, the first part of the scientific method is to do some research and to make a hypothesis. It's quite common for something to go wrong, and scientists have always known that failure is merely unexpected results. It's not the scientist's failure to admit that, and they publish the results, even though they're negative. The facts were not discarded, otherwise we wouldn't know about them today. 150 years later, think about that. You cannot just take his results and say he failed to prove some unrelated hypothesis. That is a failure as a scientist. So one of the people quoted in this paper is James Bradley, 1727. He discovered that over the course of 6 months, Stars move from their first location about 20 arc seconds in one direction, and during the next 6 months they move in the opposite direction. It makes sort of a little circle. The movement was not parallax because the movement was in a different direction than it would be if it were parallax. Bradley called the phenomenon aberration. He theorized that the phenomenon was caused by the speed of the Earth orbiting around the Sun, and then 6 months later he subtracted from the speed of light. Okay. The movement was not parallax because parallax is a displacement or difference in the apparent position of an object viewed along two different lines of sight. As you can see in the photo above on the right, you're looking at one object from two different locations. His measurements were of the movement of one star, Gamma Draconis, which appeared to move over 1 year in a small circle with a radius of 20 arc seconds. This motion would not occur if the Earth were motionless. It appears to move one way for 6 months and then in reverse for 6 months. Let me correct myself here above. Parallax is when you're looking at the distance between two stars. So you have a known distance, and so you have two stars involved, whereas aberration is one star. This is a quote. He concluded that the apparent stellar shift was brought about by the aberration of light, which was a result of the finite speed of light and the forward motion of the Earth in its orbit. On the basis of his quantitative observations of aberration, Bradley confirmed that the velocity of light is 295,000 kilometers per second, which is very, very close to what we know it to be, which is like 299,000 kilometers per second. He did not theorize about the speed of light changing. That's not in his paper. And he did not discard his results. He died in 1762, and his works were published after that. Ruggiero Giuseppe Boscovich. He's included here because he's a predecessor of Airy. Usually in science, any experiment should be validated before becoming a corollary or law. And again, they're talking about that the speed of light was a theory and it wasn't confirmed. Bradley's 20 arc second angle of aberration depends on the ratio between the speed of light and the orbital velocity of Earth. The latter, Boscovich reasoned, we cannot change the orbital velocity of the Earth, but the former we're able to reduce by means of observing the stars through a telescope filled with water. The water slows down the light, which is true, and consequently increase the angle of aberration. A water-filled telescope will thus have to be tilted more than an air-filled one. And this is from geocentricity.com, which is a flat Earth website. So like I said, he's correct. The speed of light slows from 2.99 times 10 to the 8th in a vacuum to 2.25 times 10 to the 8th in water. So next is Airy. Good old Airy. G.B. Airy in 1802, or that's when he was born. 1871, Airy implemented the verification of Bradley's aberration hypothesis proposed by Boscovich, which we just saw. It would also definitely disprove the geocentric theory of an Earth at rest. This again is from Geocentricity. Virtually every single reference for Airy's failure was a flat Earth reference. I searched and searched for Airy's failure references on Google. And just one after the other was flat Earth people using it. Most of the other references have one short sentence. By means of a water-filled telescope, Airy in 1871 looked for a change in stellar aberration through the refracting water due to an ether drag. Like in all other ether drift experiments, he obtained a negative result. So the title of Airy's paper was On a Supposed Alteration in the Amount of Astronomical Aberration of Light produced by the passage of light through a considerable thickness of refracting medium. And it was based on ether theory, which we all know there is no ether. Again quoted from FE Core. The FE Core project is not seeking to explain James Bradley's aberration movement of the stars, even though they included it in the abstract. What FE Core aims to prove is the cause of the star's daily rotation in the heavens. So Bradley, Airy, and every heliocentric model believer since Copernicus have all assumed that the Earth was moving without any direct proof. It is a belief which is contrary to well-documented daily observations. Again, Bradley was not trying to prove the daily movement of stars, and again they said that. His observation was that Gamma Draconis moved in this small circle of 20 arcseconds radius over the space of a year. So he's measuring one star as it moves over a year. He was observing the revolution of the Earth about the Sun, which many references will tell you if you look up Bradley's experiment. The daily rotation of the stars through the heavens was not Bradley's or Airy's purpose at all. Once again, they said that. No scientist in the modern age accepts facts such as the Earth's rotation without evidence. In fact, you can consider FE Core's own Bob Nodell and his proof of a 15-degree drift proving rotation, and he repeated that experiment. Bradley's experiment showing aberration is a clear proof of the Earth's revolution about the Sun and its speed relative to the speed of light. Here's a quote about good old Einstein and his theory of special relativity. Einstein's special theory of relativity states that the speed of light is constant regardless of any motion of the light source. The believers in the heliocentric theory welcomed Einstein because it created an explanation of why other experiments showed no movement of the Earth, especially Michelson-Morley. However, if Einstein was right, then Bradley's explanation of stars shifting was wrong. Funny how after Einstein's theories were embraced, none of the believers in the heliocentric model announced that their first proof of the Earth orbiting the Sun was now nonsense. And obviously it isn't nonsense, obviously, because it goes along with the theory of special relativity. Britannica states the measurements in the Michelson-Morley experiment were based on the assumption that an observer at rest in the ether would determine a different speed from the observer moving through the ether. And also, if Earth indeed moved through the ether, that motion seemed to have no effect on the measured speed of light. So Michelson-Morley proved that the speed of light did not change. If ether existed, then the Earth was motionless. If ether did not exist, then the Earth had to rotate. That also is a quote from Britannica. Now, you tell me, does ether exist? No. So the Earth has to rotate. Einstein did not disprove Bradley, whose experiment was the aberration of light and the revolution of the Earth around the Sun. Bradley's assumptions were that the speed of light was constant. Bradley's proof of the aberration of light is not nonsense. It's still current in astronomy. I checked with astronomers, and they know the aberration of light, and so it is still current today. And again, this is my comment here. I'm puzzled by the concentration in this abstract on the Earth revolving around the Sun when the stated purpose is EpiCorb aims to prove the cause of the star's daily rotation in the heavens. I'm unsure of which star EpiCorb is referring to here. If you look at that quote I just put up, they're talking about star singular and then possessive. So if it were multiple stars, it would be STARS apostrophe. So I'm just curious about that. Another quote about George Sagnac in 1913. Unfortunately for the adherents of Einstein, the time light takes to propagate from point A to B does not change with the relative motion of the source of the target. Oh, I'm sorry. Does change with the relative motion of the source of the target. This has been proved in multiple experiments. In 1913, George Sagnac's experiment and the 2003 Yi Zhang at St. Cloud University experiment are examples. The fact that fiber optic gyros can detect motion by the change in light speed is a glaring repudiation of special relativity's claim that light speed is unaffected by any motion between the source and the target. George Sagnac was a French physicist who lent his name to the Sagnac effect, a phenomenon which is the basis for interferometers and laser gyroscopes. which have been developed since the 1970s. Here's a quote from mathpages.com. If the apparatus is not moving, they call it unaccelerated, but they're talking about movement, the two beams will have equal distances around the loop. So the apparatus, if it's not moving, the two beams will travel equal distances and arrive at the detector simultaneously and in phase. However, if the entire device, including the source and the detector, is rotating, the beam traveling around the loop in the direction of rotation will have farther to go than the beam traveling counter to the direction of the beam and away from the co-rotating beam. Consequently, the beams will reach the detector at different times and slightly out of phase, producing optical interference fringes that can be observed and measured. What this means is if the apparatus is not moving at all, the two beams of light travel equal distances around this loop, and they arrive at the detector simultaneously in phase. So if you imagine two racehorses running around a track and they're running at the same speed, same track, they arrive simultaneously. Now, if you rotate the device, then the beam traveling around the loop in one direction has further to go. So what they're talking about is when it rotates, one beam has a longer distance than the other beam, and that's why they're out of phase. It's not due to change in the speed of light. It's due to the distance that the light is traveling. The usual claim that the Sagnac effect somehow falsifies the invariance of the speed of light with respect to all inertial coordinate systems. Of course, it does no such thing. This is still a quote from Math Pages. Nevertheless, it remains a seminal tenet of anti-relativityism. So people that believe Einstein was didn't know what he was talking about. The trivial Sagnac effect somehow disproves relativity. There's the link. In all of this, it's harder to prove, I'm sorry, start over. In all of this, in order to prove a motionless Earth, there first must be proof of the ether. And we go back to F.E. Core's explanation that there has to be proof of the ether first. Both ring gyros and interferometers depend on this change in the distance that light has to travel. And you can look those up to see exactly how they're made. It definitely shows that they're not talking about the speed of light changing. This Yi Zhang of St. Cloud University, his experiment was a modified Sagnac experiment. You can see that from the paper that I have there. The conclusion of the experiment, if you go down to the conclusion, the travel time difference of two counter-propagating light beams in moving fiber is proportional to both the total length and the speed of the fiber. It has nothing to do with the speed of light. And because this was kind of complicated and I wasn't sure what he was saying, I emailed Dr. Yi Zhang, and believe it or not, he replied. His comment was, you should read the paper. He was thinking that I was only reading FE Core. What you have may be from somebody, not the abstract of our paper. And then he says, our paper did not falsify special relativity. So I think we have it from the originator right there. FE Core goes back to Bradley. Does that mean that Bradley's explanation was right and therefore the Earth is moving around the sun? Not in the slightest. Bradley's theory was an explanation without any proof or evidence that the theory was correct. Why? Because there was no control. There was no test of how light changes with a moving source compared to a moving target. It is self-evident that the stars move relative to the observer on Earth. Bradley said the shifting position was because the Earth was moving, but he did not eliminate the possibility of the movement being in the star field. And again, forgive me for saying, but FE Core cannot conceive of a scientific experiment with no control. Unfortunately, this is their way of shrugging off something that they can't explain. A control, when you have a control for an experiment, this is necessary in experiments where you have a treatment. You're doing something to your experimental units. And I used to work at an agriculture experiment station. So if I'm testing different types of fertilizer, I have to have a control that has no fertilizer. And then, I have my different plots that have the different types of fertilizer. It's also used in medicine. You hear all the time about the control because of I can't think of the effect now, but so anyway, a control is not necessary when you're observing natural phenomena and offering explanations based on currently accepted science. So you're basing your experiment on assumptions of things that have already been proven. They're already currently accepted, used in different ways. He did not need to test how light changes with a moving source. That was not in his experiment. Nor was a stationary observer watching the stars and their daily apparent motions. He's not worried about daily motions. He's talking about annual motions. It is not self-evident that it is stars moving around the observer, as is well known. Flat earthers say that it's a stationary observer, and flat earthers are the ones that believe that it's a stationary Earth. So it is not self-evident. It's clearly proven over and over by current science. And then, as FE Core quoted earlier, Bradley was looking at a single star for 1 year and observing an aberration that cannot be explained by stars rotating in a uniform motion around the Earth. How could stars and planets show this backward motion? So imagine the way flat earthers talk about the stars rotating in a uniform motion around the Earth. Uh, you know, how does that explain how stars move in a backward motion? Or the planets, even the planets have retrograde motions. Sorry about the long quote. If the stars are moving and the Earth is motionless, then the light from a star directly overhead will actually be entering the tube of any telescope at an angle, and the tube must be tilted at that same angle to have a star image centered in the eyepiece. If the stars are moving, then the light enters the telescope perpendicular to the optics. Now, if there's water in the tube and the light is entering straight down the tube, then the image will not be refracted because it enters the medium of water perpendicular to the water surface. So that's by the definition of the way refraction occurs. In the case, the image through the air-filled tube and a water-filled tube will arrive at the same location. So again, if the stars are moving, those two images arrive at the same location. However, if the Earth is moving and the stars are motionless, then the light is falling vertically. The same tilt must be present in order to have the image fall in the center of the eyepiece, but the light is not entering the tube perpendicular to the optics or the surface of water in a water-filled tube. Therefore, the images from the two tubes will be in the same location. To me, this is a little confusing, and they don't really talk about how all this happens. But here is a diagram of how you calculate refraction. But first, whether you're talking about the Earth motionless or the Earth moving, the apparent motion of the stars is the same. The apparent motion of the stars is still the same, and it happens to be moving at 0.00417 degrees per second. So you can see that the movement is very small. The apparent motion of the stars will be the same from the same position on Earth. You're still seeing the same apparent motion that flat earthers see. Everybody sees that apparent motion. The problem is what causes that apparent motion. FE core will have to deal with the refraction of light as it enters the atmosphere and the Rayleigh scattering, which causes different wavelengths to be scattered. So when the sunlight enters the atmosphere, or the starlight, I'm sorry, the starlight enters the atmosphere, there's this Rayleigh scattering that causes different wavelengths of light to be scattered. So there is a problem there, I think, with the way the so-called beam of light, it's not a laser beam. So FE Core's water-filled telescope will have a water surface parallel to the ground, as flat earthers tell us. Remember, they always say flat water. The water is always flat. So this water in their telescope is going to have to be totally contained so that it doesn't move. So there's going to have to be a lens at both ends to hold the water, right? Now, when the light enters this tube, it's got to go through the lens first, and then through the water, and then through the next lens. So they're going to have a problem trying to be sure that this light stays perfectly perpendicular with this added refraction. Also, there's a thing called Snell's law, which I looked up carefully, which does not allow for a zero refraction. There's the equation. It says that the ratio of the sines of the two angles is equal to the inverse ratio of the two refractive indexes. So what they have here, you can see in that equation, sine of theta 2 over sine of theta 1, that if that theta 1 is 0, again, which if you look in that diagram above, that's what Snell's law talks about. A perpendicular light wave is going to be at a zero angle. If that's theta 1 is 0, then the sine of 0 is also 0. So, as all mathematicians know, and all of you should know, a 0 in the denominator is a problem. So this is something that FE Core would have to deal with. So now finally, after all of this background of the stars moving around, of the Earth not rotating around the sun, finally we get to the definition of their experiment. What will be tested is if the light from the stars is arriving at an angle which indicates the stars are moving, or it is starlight arriving vertically, and therefore the angle is required to capture the vertical light in the center because the telescope is moving. FE Core has chosen to construct a much improved water-filled telescope, which you see above, and use it to test the two possible explanations of the movement of the stars across the night sky. Instead of one telescope, which is used with air, and then during a second observation filled with water, we will propose a device with two tubes, one with air and one with water, but the image of each will be combined to one photographic observation point. So again, they have some complex optics going on here at the bottom, which may or may not affect those beams before they get to the camera. So there it is, folks. That's the test that they will be doing. I think that there's a lot of question about the validity of some of their background information, although it was all irrelevant to the test. And it'll be curious to see if they ever get this completed and published. Okay, so back to the joke of the week. There are 10 types of people in the world. Okay? Those who understand binary and those who don't. Think about that for a minute. So this is my review of their abstract. I hope that you understand that there's a lot of question to what they're doing and a lot of question as to the background. So this is this week's video. I hope you enjoyed watching. It's kind of long and a lot of reading. Hopefully next week we're going to have some really interesting experiments and we'll see. Thanks for viewing.